No.2 Construction Battalion is a very significant point in Canadian history. It was the one and only all-black battalion prior to Confederation, or after Confederation, I'd say rather. And what took place there is that blacks were denied the right to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces. And when the call went out for young Canadian men, and keep in mind in those days it was men who were being called to serve, when the call went out for young Canadian men to defend their country and to join the armed forces and to defend England, because at that time Canada was not a nation, it was a colony of England. People came from all corners of the country to do so. And blacks also got caught up in that fervor. They also went to recruiting stations, but they were told they could not serve. This was a white man's war. They didn't want a checkerboard army. They were denied the right. Now, I mean, if you think of that, right, you arrive there, you leave home, you walk, you get drives, you hitchhike, do whatever. You go there and someone tells you no. Then you turn around and walk back home. Now your family's expecting you to have joined the army, joined the armed forces, your friends. You've told people the embarrassment, the humiliation. But at that time, the country said, it will not happen. We will not have blacks in the army. We will not have coloreds in the army. Because they felt that, first of all, there were no serving individuals who would want to serve with black soldiers. And the chief general said at that time as well, it would be humiliating to the blacks to serve in forces. He felt he was doing blacks a service, but not allowing them. And that's where you get the paternal aspect that came into play. And that being the case, you know, that was a lingering part of that time. And we still have to some respects, but obviously much more overt at that point in time. So when they said no blacks, they felt they were doing it for the country, doing it for the best of the army, and doing it for those young black men. Because they did not look at them as being soldiers. They were vain, they were imitative, so they were told. And they could not serve in the army. So they had to fight in order to fight. Imagine that. Fight in order to fight. And then when they were allowed in, they went in not as an armed group, not as their white neighbors and colleagues, whatever. They went as a construction battalion. They were given shovels, they were given picks, they were given axes, and they were sent overseas to dig trenches, to string barbed wire, to do that kind of work. Tasks that were very important, extremely important, but they did not sign on for that particular duty. They didn't volunteer for that duty, but they were given that. They were told they could do nothing else other than that fact. So that's how the Construction Battalion came into being. And it was extraordinary once again because it was a compromise. Initially it would be none whatsoever, but the pressure that came from the black community came from the white community as well to let these men serve. That was a compromise. And so they decided on an all segregated unit to go into the war. They were segregated in the recruitment. They were segregated then in their training. They were segregated when they went overseas. If they went to the hospital, there was a segregated part of the hospital for them to go to. If they in fact were incarcerated or put into or locked up, there was a separate jail, a separate area for them to go to. The YMCA, if they had any recreation, was separate and apart. They remained segregated throughout the entire war, and they came home as a segregated unit. So you know they were there really in a very less than full complement. They weren't given the full respect that they deserved. They weren't from start to finish. And when they came home and people eventually died, they were put into a segregated area in Camp Hill Cemetery. So when it was finally decided to put together a black battalion, although there was still strong support from Nova Scotia and parts of Canada, the numbers weren't what they were hoping they would be. So for the first time in Canadian history, a Canadian battalion, Canadian regiment, went outside the borders, went beyond its arms. So they began to advertise in other parts of the United States, in the Caribbean, where there were black populations. They made people aware of that fact. And people who in their own countries either A, were denied the right to fight or didn't have the ability because of the size, came to Canada to join the Black Battalion. Because Nova Scotia, once again, to this very day, has the largest black indigenous population. So Nova Scotia became the cornerstone. Nova Scotia became the headquarters of it. And the then Prime Minister of Canada, Robert Borden, had a Nova Scotian connection as well, right? That's a Nova Scotian. So Nova Scotia became this place where people gathered. And keep in mind as well, if you look at the black loyalists who live here in Nova Scotia, who came from the United States, there's this very real connection with parts of the United States from Canada. From the Caribbean, my father's family comes from Barbados. They came and worked here in the steel mill a great many years ago. There's always been these connections that have got there. These were the early days of, familial social media. So by way of people carrying the story. So they came in, people came to fight. Once again, that was the black population from around the world, or at least North America, coming to Canada to join up with an army to fight for a country that appeared not to want them. Once again, it boggles the mind that there are men who were willing to put their lives on the line when a country was turned its back on them, and that they came from elsewhere, I think is a very significant story, which is why the Consul General being there, which is why, even if I may mention, for the very first commemoration ceremony they held in Pictou, the one I mentioned earlier, there were members who came from the Tuskegee Airmen, which Tuskegee Airmen was an all-black Air Force unit in the United States of America, the one and only all-black Air Force unit. They've been treated much like the No.2 Construction Battalion. They fought in the Second World War, but the Tuskegee Airmen became also very, very famous. But they're known better than the No.2 Construction Battalion, which became the secret. So this call went out. The clarion call went out for young black men to come and defend king and country. And these men, the United States didn't have a king. We weren't a nation, but they came. And they came. And because of them, we had a construction battalion. Without their numbers, we couldn't have done it. So they were very important to this whole thing being formed. It was not known. It remained really as in my father's book on the No.2 Construction Battalion, which interesting enough was reissued this year and a short while ago by Nimbus Publishing with a new foreword written by my daughter to talk about this book. But one thing he described it as a subtitle was Canada's best kept military secret. Not that they necessarily hid it deliberately, but it was put aside, put away. In part out of shame, but also in part because people didn't want to acknowledge it's actually taking place, that there really was an all-black battalion that came into being. In fact, and the men who served in the battalion didn't speak about it freely either. Now, I can't say why that was the case. Was it embarrassment? Was the fact that when people come back from war, they often don't speak about what took place over there. War is ugly. This was ugly from the get-go. It was ugly in the sense of war itself. It was ugly the way they were treated. They were still on the battlefront. They were still there, but unarmed, because they were there to do what one would describe as important tasks, but in the overall scheme of things, possibly even described as being menial tasks. In other words, they expected to be on the front line with guns, with rifles, to defend their country. They were there and they were told to dig trenches, to dig latrines, to cut lumber for the railway, to cut lumber for the other parts of the services to utilize. They were not there to serve in the army as the rest of the individuals, as their white Canadian colleagues were. They weren't there for that purpose. All those tasks I said before were exceedingly important. An army cannot function without that kind of a unit to assist them. But you expect someone to have the right, at the very least, to volunteer to do that, to put their name forward to do that, or if they're going to do it, to be shown the respect for doing it. But they weren't shown that kind of respect. They were denigrated for doing it. At the time of doing it, they didn't receive any respect for doing it, so they didn't view it as being necessarily a worthwhile part of the war effort. It was almost like a stopgap measure. We can hold them here for a while. Don't forget, it wasn't until the war started in 1914. It wasn't until 1916 that the Black Battalion was put together. So 2 years had already gone by. And interesting enough, at the same time, Canadian volunteers the numbers had fallen down dramatically. So when blacks went in, it was during the time when there was conscription as well. So you go from fighting to get in, now being told you have to join, but told you have to join in a all-black unit, an all-black battalion. So once again, when I look back at it, I think how extraordinary it was that they even went. Because my first response was say, if you didn't want it before, I'm not going now. But they went, they served. One of my great uncle served. He didn't make it over to Europe. He died on the transport ship going over. We don't know what happened. Was it an illness of some type? Was it a lack of medical attention? We don't know. The records don't show that. But it was also, when I look at the lack of respect they received, whenever you send a troop ship overseas to Europe, it goes with a complement of naval vessels to guard it. It was proposed that the Black Battalion would go over on a vessel without any kind of escort. Somebody was actually proposed that. Now, eventually that was changed, so they won't say, but somebody thought this would be okay. And this would be okay because the company that owned the ship was willing to give it a try. They were more concerned about the ship than about the men who were on the ship. And why? When those things happened, this was not a well-known part of Canadian history. And it wasn't well-known, I'd say, for different reasons, but also when they came back, they trained in obscurity, they served in obscurity, and they came back in virtual obscurity. And when they came back, the battalion, a year later, was disbanded. So there were no remnants of it. There's nothing to say, here's the Black Battalion. It no longer existed. So it came into being, and then it vanished. And it wasn't until my father began doing his work and his research that it was found there was this Black Battalion that had existed. He had heard of it when he was a young man. He had seen the lapel pins on the buttons of individuals who were porters, black porters on the railway. And he asked them what it was. And he spoke of this Black Battalion. He didn't know of it. He didn't know of it. And then he started asking them more and more about it. And it became important to him to find out what the story was. And the story became amazing in and of itself. But it took a lot of years to find it out. Because even when you first started, there wasn't a big interest in this. And at that time, it was in some ways, a confluence of fates, a confluence of circumstances, that he started his interest while there were still members alive. They no longer exist. It's a 100-year anniversary this year. These men no longer exist. He had the ability to speak directly to people who had served and to their families. You couldn't do that now. So some first-hand accounts in his book of what it was like to be overseas at that time. My mother knew that her uncle had passed away during that period of time. Didn't know how or why, or even that he was a member of the Black Battalion. It came when my dad was doing his research, and they were going through the rolls, and found out there was his name of my great uncle, and my father pointed to my mother. This is your uncle who was on this vessel. We did not know it. In our own family, we didn't know this. And what made this story even more extraordinary has been the fact that people finding out they have relatives who had served in the Construction Battalion, who did not know it. And some were fathers, some were brothers, great nephews, whatever the case may be. Suddenly we find these names. We had these pictures that were like anonymous pictures, no names to them. And people begin to say, that's my uncle, that's my father, that's my grandfather. And slowly they were getting to identify these men of the Construction Battalion. And I say men, they were boys. Right? Some were 15 years old, some were 18. They were virtual kids who went over there. But they went over being treated as they were less than important. And I say, it's an extraordinary story. And when you look at what remains as part of us in this day and age, when you've had as a people go through those sort of things, it lingers. You may not know the story, but you can feel the hurt. So when somebody says something which is hurtful, which may not seem to impact upon someone else in the same way, it rings deep, it resonates. So when somebody puts you down or denigrates, yeah, it has a very real sting to it. And there's a history of that sort of pattern. So we saw it back in those days. It was overt. It was an extraordinary piece of Canadian history, not just Black history, Canadian history. So we spoke of the fact that my father had spotted these older porters on the CN rail with a lapel pin that he didn't recognize. And when he asked them about it, they told him about the No.2 Construction Battalion, to which he did not know anything about it whatsoever. But it twigged his curiosity. What's this Black Battalion? My father was always interested in history, Black history, and military history. His three loves. And here it was, all in one spot. But he had his own concerns, his own worries. It caught attention, but he had a family to raise. He had his own struggles to deal with. I mean, my family, when they first moved from Halifax to Dartmouth, a petition was taken out to keep our family or the neighborhood. So he had to deal with those kind of issues from the education for his children, from his work. But the Black Battalion never left his attention. So finally, I think about 1982 or thereabouts, along with the Black Cultural Center, they held a ceremony at the Lord Nelson Hotel in Halifax to commemorate the surviving members of the Black Battalion. And at that time, they got together 7 people, 7 members. And these were old men at the time. They were frail. But once again, when they came walking in and people stood up to applaud them, you could see the look on their faces, right? The pride that they felt as they came down there. And it was an extraordinary night. And once again, as I said before, I mentioned about other events, that was going to be a one-off. But my father felt, this is good, but it can be forgotten. And that's when he thought about writing the book. So he began to work on the research. My father was not an author at the time. He had not written books. He loved writing, but he'd never written a book. But he started researching it. And at that point, it was a confluence of events. He could still talk to people, talk to the families, get the information directly from them. And then when he went to Ottawa and the National Archives, it was like this treasure trove of information that had been buried away. Not hidden, but just buried, lost in some ways. And he started finding things. And Reverend White's diary and all the information came to light. And more and more. And he became just so taken by it. So he started working on this book. He knew he had to get the story out there. And he prepared this book with the Black Cultural Center, with their support, on the No.2 Construction Battalion, Canada's best kept military secret. And they first published, the Cultural Center published the first book on its own. Eventually Nimbus took it up and they published it. And then Nimbus, as I said, did the re-release. And this year, for the 100th anniversary and for the 30 years after the book was released, my daughter, Lindsay Ruck, wrote the foreword, who wrote the book on her grandfather, Sandra Ruck. And for me, as a father, as a son, that's something very, very special. Very, very special. And I must say that to this day, when I read my father's book and my daughter's book, it still brings tears to my eyes. It's that effective, because you look at what they accomplished, my father accomplished, and the fact that his granddaughter is able to carry that on and speak those words that helps to carry on his legacy. It's extreme. I feel very fortunate in that regards. And for me, that's my personal legacy from the Black Battalion. That's from a family aspect. So when my father took this task on and put this book together, he did not expect it would ever grow in this way. He just wanted something that could be in libraries that people could have, and that would help to satisfy it. Look at it now. Look at it now. We have the film that has been made on the Black Battalion, Honor Before Glory. We have work being done. We have posters. Let's say the stamp. None of that was on the radar. An accomplishment, extra. His legacy, and then the battalion, absolutely extraordinary. And I see my daughters now pick up the torch and is going with that as well. It's an extraordinary event. If you look at a military, both naval, eventually Air Force, as well as the Army, that had in some cases almost a written policy, or in the case of the Army, a non-written policy, but in the case of a policy that only able-bodied white men were able to participate. If it hadn't been for the Construction Battalion, how much longer would that have gone on? We have young men and women serving today that the Construction Battalion opened the road. They're the ones who paved the way for it. Canada realized that there was a purpose, there was a value here. But many of those young black men and women who served in this day, in present time, aren't aware or weren't aware. Weren't aware of the Construction Battalion. Being a member of the military didn't mean that you had insight into this group. I've spoken to different military bases and different military individuals. They weren't aware of the No.2 Construction Battalion. Now, one thing I feel is very fortunate is that there are now, at the present time, there are commanders and generals and those who have a level of authority who are very interested and have taken on the task of spreading the word. Make sure that it's known to all those who join. Once again, regardless of color. Because one of the concerns we must have is that not to revert back. It wouldn't be the same. It would not be in the same overt manner, but it is possible to have barriers and blocks put in place, sometimes even inadvertently, without realizing the impact. As I said before, it was felt by keeping these young men away from the First World War back in 1914 that they were doing them a favor, that they would not want them to be humiliated, would not want them to be where they were not wanted. And we can still have people making sometimes decisions that impact us negatively, but they look at it as being helpful. Somehow it's of assisting us. And it still happens. So the No.2 Construction Battalion, it changed the face of the military. It changed the color of the military by allowing those men in. When you can look at those at the 100th anniversary in Pictou a week ago, when those young men, as part of the parade at the outset, came down the street wearing the uniforms of the No.2 Construction Battalion, you could feel it. It was the most stirring moment. I've seen many military parades, all of which, mind you, with the pipes and the drums, are all very moving. But when they took that walk, and they walked there, and it took you right back to 1916 and what they would have went through, you realize these were people who really wanted to do something for their country and weren't allowed. So it's very significant. And I think that for everyone who wears a uniform, when they look at it as well, and when young blacks are in the military, they look at it and say, look, these are my ancestors. These are people that I can look up to. These are role models. They were kids, but they were role models of this day and age. Even though they were given such a small piece to do, which proved once again very important, not to diminish the task, but the way in which they were treated, they still want to serve. they were still that committed to their country, a country that did not want them. They treated their country much better than their country treated them, completely. And once again, they're to be congratulated for it. It's the unfortunate part we don't have them here with us today. You can tell them these things. If they could have seen the 100th anniversary, they could have known that themselves, because it was as those who were in attendance. When you have the cost center in Pictou filled, and the overflow tent filled, people there to commemorate these men, these young men, who many of them, I say, died in pretty much obscurity, without ever knowing that they had served. It's quite an extraordinary story, the whole thing. So as I mentioned, the 100th anniversary was held in Pictou, as it has been now since 1992, and Pictou has become so significant because this was where they first came together. Eventually they went off to Truro, but Pictou was the town where they came in, and of course, and Sutherland, who became the commander of the battalion, a white gentleman, came from the Pictou area, River John area, and so he was there. Now, what I personally find significant about Pictou, before knowing about the battalion, for me, Pictou was a town along the shore. Pictou has a strong Scottish background, and I think they're to be proud of that. The Hector came into Pictou. The Hector is there, the ship is there. But Pictou did not mean very much to me. Pictou, in fact, was almost, I wouldn't say viewed as being unfriendly, but I did not view Pictou as being particularly welcoming. And that's based upon my own perceptions. Partly because the few times I would have been in Pictou, if I would have gone to Pictou with my father and my parents when I was younger, I wouldn't have seen anybody of color. I didn't see any black people on the streets. I knew there were people living on the outskirts, but I never saw people in Pictou. And when I would go into a restaurant, I would feel that you weren't really being fully welcomed. But I did not know the history of Pictou. Pictou played an important role in Canadian history. Pictou welcomed these men. Pictou was where they gathered. Pictou was the area that enabled them to begin to form the Black Battalion. So when my father went back a number of years ago, when he was living to Pictou, before this ever started, and he felt there should be a commemoration ceremony held in Pictou. And on the waterfront, because from the waterfront was the important part of where people gathered. So when they put this together, and eventually went to the commemoration ceremony, where they put the plaques out there, they put the monuments out there, Pictou now has its rightful place in Canadian history that anyone can now see. And so it's important for the townspeople to realize that. It's important for the municipal council to realize that. And for all Nova Scotian Canadians to realize Pictou and its rightful place. So Pictou will continue to be a very important part of the Black Battalion. It and the Black Battalion are now, to my mind, synonymous. That's how I now see Pictou. I feel that I have a vested interest in the town of Pictou that I will never be able to put away. And I hope that they feel the same way as well. So it's a very special place. So when these ceremonies took place in Pictou, it was a time to commemorate the Black Battalion and also say thank you to the town. And when this parade took place, you were watching them walk down that street, and you realized that 100 years ago, approximately, there would have been something similar to that. That for the first time, a town that was for the most part principally white would have had a large influx of black males in there, which would have been quite a change for the town itself. But I did not read, have not read of there being conflict in that time, conflict in other areas, but not in Pictou. So it's a very special occasion. So that we go back to the 100th, I think it was important to have the mayor of the town there, the former mayor, Mayor LeBlanc there, Mayor Halls, the present mayor, to be able to say thank you, then let them celebrating it. Because it was, what started out there when they held the very first commemoration ceremony in Pictou. It was going to be, I think, for the most part, a one-off. That was going to be it. People came from the United States. It was a hot day, and we gathered outside on the waterfront. And it was a marvelous day. I say people came from different parts of the country and gathered there. But for the most part, they were looking at this as being the big hurrah. And we would all then go back to our respective places and say that was job well done, and the monuments would be there in way of memory. But Mayor LeBlanc, during the course of his speech, which was very graceful and very thankful to everyone, and spoke very kindly on my father. But then he ended up by saying that he's inviting everyone to come back to Pictou each year to celebrate the Black Battalion. Those words proved to be extremely significant. That invitation, once again from the town of Pictou, once again on behalf of the Black Battalion, has brought this back. Also a significant part of why we have this 100th year anniversary in Pictou. It started that point, and it led us up to this point here. The invitation was a standing invitation, and the Black Cultural Center, people in Nova Scotia, have gone back each year. Sometimes the crowds haven't been great, insofar as, there's been weather conditions, there's been people of other factors, but it's always gone back. And this year we saw the outpouring, when we had the town was once again inundated with people from elsewhere. And people came there to enjoy themselves and to celebrate it. And there was this sense of camaraderie, a sense of oneness, regardless of color. And this is important, particularly when we look at things that are going on now in this world. There's a lot of racial strife right now. Pictou stands even more now than what it did probably previously. It's as significant now as it was 100 years ago, if not even more so. Because now, by the way, the media is able to report things and we get stories out so quickly. People didn't know about the Black Battalion back in those days. But this kind of event that we had there this past weekend was significant. Well, the 100th anniversary, once again, was a long time in the making. Well, 100 years in the making, wasn't it? So, and despite my age, I wasn't involved in the entire thing. But having said that, a lot of effort went into it. A lot of effort went into the town, into celebration. And so it was important as well, and in some ways, it's trying to balance the significance with the length of the program. It's important to acknowledge the men of the Construction Battalion. It was important to have their descendants there, family members there who were in attendance, and to have them recognized as such. It was important to have the military. The military must be part of these events. And it's one thing to have the men and women in uniform there, but also to have the command level there. These things, particularly the military, start from the top. Right? If you can get on side those who have the authority, who can make it happen, you've come a long ways. And they were invited to attend. So we have, and from the guest speaker, from the keynote speaker, to the members of the armed forces, be they Air Force, Navy, and the Army, were all present on that day. And when they come together, along with the politicians, and I say the political component is also very important because these things require support. They require money. And events such as that took a fair bit to do it. As much as we like to say that we can sustain ourselves, it can't be done. You need to have support of the municipal government, the town of Pictou, the provincial government, and the federal government. Funding came to it. So you need to have those individuals present as well, and to give them a chance also to express their support for it. And they did. And I must say, and I think it's very important to mention this, one of the greatest supporters of this very event has been the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. He and his wife, former Brigadier General Grant, is extraordinary. The respect I hold for that couple, I think, is just simply untold. It's not. They go to many events, and I've said this before in their presence. They go to many events, and they do so as part of their official office. But I have never yet felt that they are solely in Pictou merely to perform an official duty. They are there because they want to be there. He was the honorary chairperson for this year's event. We wanted to put his name forward, to have his name stand on the letterhead, and he and his wife are there. To me, a lot of the progress we've made in the last number of years have been directly attributable to that kind of support. That's, once again, a debt that cannot be repaid. But in many ways, they look at it as a debt that they owe to the Black Battalion, and they're part of it. He's a military man. Right? He understands what it means. And so when they are there, and I look and I watch them, and I see the honest appreciation in their face and the rapport they have with everyone else there, I say, this whole thing, the Black Battalion, is gathering more and more strength. And so once again, people who've held it together over the years, this was, I think, to many of them, a point of encouragement, reinforcement that the efforts were not wasted, that all the time it was put in. And from my father's perspective, who's no longer with us, from my father's perspective, he would have been completely both delighted, as well as, I think, very humbled by seeing what has come of this book that he had written about the Limited Construction Battalion. The fact that this year we had the unveiling of the stamp. Canada Post put the stamp over the Black Battalion. African Heritage Month, Nova Scotia, the theme was they fought to fight. It was the Construction Battalion. There's events coming up down the road in Bridgetown that's going to also be talking about the Black Battalion. It started with my father as a young man seeing porters on the railroad with a pin in their lapel. That's where it began. And he knew he had to write a book. It took him 30-something years later to get this book out there. But to see the life it has taken. I talked about the segregated graves at Camp Hill Hospital, or Camp Hill Graveyard, or cemetery rather. Now there's special plaques commemorating those men in that graveyard. All these steps, incremental changes. And in some ways, the book that my daughter, Lindsay, wrote about my father is reflective of the very thing the Black Battalion did. They did things one step at a time. My father's life was very much that same way. He knew he couldn't put something together necessarily with a large endowment. So, much like the Black Battalion, if you're going to have to cut wood to do things, he would do it. He would sell chocolate bars to create scholarship funds. Now you get that, you see that kind of perseverance and tenacity from the Black Battalion. They were out there cutting trees, one tree at a time, right, manually, just to support the war effort. My father sold chocolate bars to support students going to university, black students going to university. The more I read the book that my daughter wrote about my father and my father's book on the Black Battalion, the more I see those parallels. It's an important part of our history. So for me, for my family, a part of this celebration in Pictou was also commemorating and remembering my father and the work that he did down there, which he did out of was very was selfless. He didn't do it for his own self-esteem. He did it so others would not forget the story. And I now see his name being mentioned in this way. When we talk about the Black Battalion, we talk about my father, the late Senator Calvin Ruck, in the same breath. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. So that celebration in Pictou, when we came down for the 100th anniversary, it was celebrating so much. I think everybody who was there, who has a connection to the battalion, or those who have even developed a new connection, in their own way, it's something to celebrate. Everybody, I think, had their own individual part of it that was important. To see others in uniform, to see more and more black men and women now in uniform, to see the military up on the platform, and wanting to be part of this, wanting to be part of it, having the DeCoste Center full. When these men had to fight to get into the battle, had to fight, it's a big change. And every person that's told, every person that's there, tells somebody else. Right? So if you have 700 people in attendance and you multiply that, the ripple effect, how do you even begin to judge that? How do you even begin to judge that, what it means? So a story that before was a best kept military secret is now becoming one of Canada's best kept military stories, because the story will live on. My father's no longer here, but the story lives on. It's stronger now than it was when he first wrote the book, much stronger. So as mentioned, having support of the provincial government, having support of all level of governments is key. But that support, I think, has to go beyond just the dollar, as it were. It has to be seen. One can send money, one can give a grant, but this is happening every day. Always appreciate it, always need it. But what I felt was significant was having the Premier in attendance and watching him become part of the event. And I'll give him full credit. Politicians certainly cannot pass up the opportunity whenever it presents itself to make a politically induced or politically pointed speech. Premier McNeill came to the podium and gave a speech which I felt was an expression of honest emotion. He conceded that up until a few years ago, he was not aware of the Black Battalion. He conceded that up until a few years ago, he didn't know this part of Canadian history. He opened himself up to that. Right, the moment that he did that, he received the respect and support of the people who were there, because most of us were in that category at some point in time. And to have him make that, and therefore we were all sharing in this journey of learning about the Black Battalion. And the Premier of Nova Scotia was on part of that. He was with us on that journey. And his speech, which I think was speaking from the heart, captured the attention of everybody who was there. And I think he's owed full credit for that, because I have no doubt that he could have given very much of a well-documented, a well-structured speech that for the most part would touched on talking points. Well, this wasn't that kind of a speech. It wasn't that kind of a speech. It was a speech of a man who was there as part of this event, respecting the Black Battalion. And because at the end of the day, we were there for the Black Battalion. And that was the key point. And I think he showed the Black Battalion the honor and the respect it deserved to receive. These are tough times racially. I wish that I could say to you in the year 2016 that all of our racial strife is now behind us. We have resolved these things. So we live as one, brothers and sisters, regardless of color, regardless of creed, regardless of religion. We don't have that. And in fact, if you look towards across the border, it appears in the United States that despite having gone through a period with the first Black president, we seem to be regressing. We find ourselves in the midst of heavy racial tensions, not just people protest, not just people who are issuing slurs against each other. We have people dying in the streets that all appears to be racially motivated. And I say appears because also other factors from gun control and every other thing there. But for the most part, we have something that centers on race. It's race that's involved. It's race that's at the key of it. To have the American Consul General, first of all, be on the platform, I think was very important. And I want to go back just very quickly. There were a couple of things that I think are significant. When blacks were denied the right to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces, it had been suggested at one point by the then, I guess, Chief of Staff, probably the proper title, but the Chief of Staff, that perhaps they could go and serve in the U.S. They could go to the U.S. and serve because they get more pay there and maybe they feel more at home, sort of thing. Once again, I said he didn't want to be humiliated here in Canada, so let's let them across the border, let them serve over there, because there they may have more of a reason for doing so. Well, that didn't happen. But in fact, when Canada formed the Black Battalion, a large number of U.S. black men came to Canada and became part of the Black Battalion here in Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia black men made up the largest number of recruits for the Black Battalion. But we had people from the West Indies who joined the Black Battalion. So to have the U.S. Consul General there was both significant and fitting. And one thing that he did as well, which I felt, I think, captured the essence of the day as we came together in this group, was to highlight the problems that we're currently seeing in the United States, where there are people dying in the streets because of gun violence that seems to be racially backed, racially motivated. And he was able to pinpoint that. We set that auditorium. That auditorium was a mixture of people, a mixture of colors, a mixture of gender, a mixture of religions. And we set there as a group honoring one group, the Black Battalion. It's a shame that we can't have that happening every single day. We know we can't, but when the Consul General spoke what's taking place in the United States, I think everyone there, given the fact that the day before, a couple days beforehand, we had 5 officers shot down in Dallas, Texas. A few days before then, we had 2 young black men shot and killed by police officers. Where does the answer lie to this? We don't have it. We don't have an immediate answer. But I can say to you that what we saw in Pictou at the very least gives us at least a sense that the situation can change. This is Canada, but Canada and the U.S. are linked. They're linked. He's here representing the government. To have him attend this event, to have him acknowledge the fact that it's in his own country there's these problems, and to honor the Black Battalion, I think bodes well. There's still a long road to go, obviously, but it was important to have that done because I think, as was mentioned, the moment that he said that, the moment that he acknowledged that situation, it changed the feeling in the room once again. Because that was, and even in the opening prayer, Pastor Brian Johnson mentioned the thing, that we're stronger as one. And that became sort of the sentiment for the day. And the Consul General confirmed that. There's a country there that needs to come together. But right now, there's a lot of worries for me personally as to whether or not, how or when that takes place. These are difficult times for the United States of America. And we as Canada cannot look at it and say, yes, but it's not us. We cannot do that. We cannot do that. We have to be very aware of it, very conscious of it, and hopefully, wherever we can, to assist in it. By having him here the Consul General here, and part of this, I think helps that, because we're showing support for the United States, and we have the United States supporting us in this kind of endeavor. So I say it's a long road to go yet, but hopefully if we can keep these kind of events going and continue to have individuals such as that representing the U.S. government, part of Nova Scotian events, part of Canadian events, then hopefully we can begin to move things ahead. And maybe, as my father always believed in, not necessarily what you say, but what you do. You prove by example, right? That's how you become a role model. You practice what you preach. And not necessarily by waving a large stick. It's just being out there and just doing it. If it's selling chocolate bars, if it's cutting wood, doing whatever. From the Black Battalion to the present day. It's that one step at a time. It can't change overnight. When this began, my father's journey with the Black Battalion began, the 100th anniversary was not even thought of. Obviously one would say that logically, we knew 100-year celebration, 100 years had to come up at some point. But it wasn't on the radar. It wasn't on the radar. It was that one step at a time. And when we see this take place now, we feel that, and I say we, speaking on behalf of the Black Cultural Center, speaking on behalf of Black Nova Scotians, I take the liberty of doing so, right? I don't have the authority, but I take the liberty of doing so. It shows us that the Black Battalion was significant, that as a population in this province, we are significant. It helps to, we don't have that people need validation, but sometimes our historical past requires validation. So where this before was, there was a level of denigration, of being ignored, of being set aside. The fact you can look at it now with pride impacts on us today in 2016. 100 years ago, people I think were leaving that gathering in Pictou. People were walking out of the cost center, walking out of the overflow tent with pride. I may be overstating it, but I think people were walking taller and straighter when they were leaving there. It's what they felt they were part of something. Right? They didn't serve with those men, they didn't suffer with those men, but those men are part of us. The point that I raised at the course of the event when I spoke was that we are the Black Battalion. There's a part of us, a part of them within us, and a part of us was with them. The future was with those men. They didn't know it. They did not go overseas on that boat or cut that wood or lay those railway ties or that barbed wire saying 100 years down the road, people are going to say with pride that we did this. No, but yet that's what happened. So this event had a significance that I can't even begin to document properly because that's still unfolding. But the fact that there were now children, my own daughters who are now young women, but younger children who know the Black Battalion, people who are now telling their families, their relatives about the Black Battalion. There's its legacy. The legacy of the battalion is a significant part of its history, what it can do for relations, we talk about race relations, what it can do for the feeling of self-worth. And we still sometimes have a problem when it comes to self-worth. But when your history is being acknowledged 100 years down the road, then that's significant. That means that people can look at it with a great deal of pride. And therefore, no matter of your age, no matter of, say, insofar as that moment, not just blacks left that auditorium feeling pride. I think everyone who was there, regardless of the color, felt part of that Black Battalion. That's important. History should never be designated as just one group. This is my history, not your history. Or your history, not my history. See, it can't be that way. The Black Battalion is something that we share with all of us. So the 100th-year anniversary gives that opportunity. And if that room had just been filled by only Black Nova Scotians, I would have said it was a great event. It was a successful event. But it would not have been the kind of event that it could have been. But it wasn't. It was an event that captured people from all across the province. And in fact, people from, not just the province, I've met people from Ontario, people from the US who came to that event, who came down to that event. There's the significance. That's the Black Battalion's strength. Its legacy is going to go on. Hopefully in, be it 10 years' time, 50 years' time, someone else will be sitting in this chair talking about it. My hope is that there will be someone talking about it as it moves ahead and the more that it means. Because I don't know what the future holds for the Black Battalion. But right now there's talk of having it commemorated even in a greater level within the military itself, of giving it back its battalion status, doing all these sort of things. That's important. So I'm hopeful for the future, saddened in some ways by the past, but hopeful for the future. What came out of that? So I'm looking for my children and my children's children to know the Black Battalion, for your children to know the Black Battalion and what it meant for all of us. So that when we gather and people talk about it in schools, not just an African Heritage Month, not just on a 100th anniversary, but as part of our regular history. That is when I think we have truly accomplished something.